Hey church, welcome to this week's small group. And I'm all excited about Easter. I've got my Easter shirt on ahead of time. But before we start talking about Easter, let's remember what we talked about this last Sunday. Don't walk away from people who have walked away from Christ, because you never know what Jesus is going to do with them. I want to start out this small group with two questions. What is it like for a person who has walked away from Jesus to come back to church? Perhaps you've known somebody like that. Perhaps you were that person. And what are some of the mistakes that church people can make when dealing with people who have walked away from Jesus? In this week's story, we're going to talk about Jesus restoring Peter. But remember that Peter has denied Jesus. Jesus has died on a cross. He's been resurrected again. He's appeared to the disciples several times. And Peter is still dealing with the guilt of walking away from Jesus. The disciples are lost and they just don't know what to do. And then we get to John chapter 21, verses 2 through 3. Why do you think Peter went back to fishing in this passage? And how might this be familiar to what people who have walked away from Jesus do? You see, Peter was a fisherman before he followed Jesus. And so without Jesus, he just went back to what he knew. And I think most of us have a tendency, when we walk away from Jesus, that we just go back to what we did before Jesus. Next, I want you to read the next few verses, John chapter 21, verses 4 through 8. How did John, who in this passage is the disciple who Jesus loved, how did John know that the man on the shore was Jesus? And why do you think Peter decided to jump into the water and to swim to Jesus? Perhaps Peter was trying to demonstrate to Jesus that he was willing to leave everything for Jesus again. Next, I want you to read the story of how Jesus first met Peter, James, and John, and how he called them, because I think it will help us to understand why this final story is so significant. So read Luke chapter 5, verses 2 through 11. What is similar between this story and the story of John chapter 21? Do you think this story had something to do with how John knew it was Jesus on the shore in John chapter 21? Also, when considering both of these stories together, what was Jesus reminding the disciples to do? Notice that in both stories, they fished all night and caught nothing. Jesus told them to put their nets out one more time, and they had this miraculous catch that was too big for their nets and for their boats. I think John remembered that this was the way that they met Jesus in the very beginning. And I think for Peter, James, and John, this was a reset button. This was a way to start fresh with Jesus. And he was calling them to do what he had called them to do from the very beginning, which was to be fishers of men. Next, I want you to read John chapter 21, verses 9 through 14. Does it feel as though Peter is trying to prove something in this passage? What was he trying to do? And when people walk away from Jesus and then come back, what might they do to prove their loyalty to Jesus? And is that necessary? It feels to me as if Peter is jumping at the opportunity to serve Jesus and to show how devoted he is to Jesus. I'm going to jump in the water and show Jesus how much I love him. I'm going to pull in the nets by myself and show Jesus how much I love him. I think some people try to give penance to God to pay for walking away from Jesus. But you know what? Like the prodigal son who comes to his father and he goes, "Man, Dad, I don't deserve to be your son. I just want to be your servant." Remember the Father, he doesn't even listen to the Son. He's just celebrating over the fact that his Son has returned. Next, if you have anyone who speaks Spanish in the group, I want to encourage you to read John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19 in a Spanish Bible. And you can look it up on your phone if you don't have a Spanish Bible with you. But read these verses in Spanish and explain to the rest of the group the difference for the words love in these next few verses. And then answer these questions. Why was it important for Peter to declare his love for Jesus 3 times? And did Peter have to do anything to be restored to ministry? I believe that Jesus wanted Peter to declare his love for Jesus once for every time that Peter had denied him. I think it was important for him to be able to declare his love to Jesus face to face. And when Jesus said, "Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, and feed my sheep," he was basically saying, go do ministry again. Peter's only prerequisite to being restored to ministry was loving Jesus. He didn't have to do anything to be restored. Let's close with these questions. What does this story tell us about how we should restore people who have walked away from Jesus? What are the names of a few people that you are going to invite to Easter at the Pulse? And remember, it doesn't have to be somebody who's never been to church before. Maybe it needs to be somebody who needs to be restored to Jesus. And finally, I want you to pray for the people who you will be inviting to church this Sunday. And remember, don't walk away from people who have walked away from Christ. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you on Easter.